So we need to talk about the dominant generation of the plant. Remember, there's a gametophyte and a sporophyte generation. So when we get to plants on land that have vascular tissue, so they're a little bit larger plants, in these plants, the sporophyte is the larger and the dominant generation. So it's the plant, the generation of the plant that you recognize, whether it's a pine tree or a rose bush. It's large, you can see it, that's the sporophyte generation. So for the non-vascular plants, the gametophyte is the dominant generation, and these are going to be smaller plants all around, but that's going to be the part that you recognize. And then so for the vascular plants, the sporophyte is going to be the dominant generation. Okay, so on this diagram, you can see both the sporophyte and gametophyte generation. And what I like is that it shows the sporophyte in kind of the tan color and the gametophyte in the blue color. And so if you look at the moss, which is the lower form of a land plant, it's the least complicated, it's the simplest. You can see that the gametophyte is dominant. Much more of the blue is showing, and so that's the dominant version. But when you get to the fern, which is the next step up, you see that the gametophyte is becoming less dominant and the sporophyte is becoming dominant. And when we get to gymnosperms, which are cone-bearing plants, the sporophyte generation is dominant and the gametophyte generation is tiny, it's microscopic. And the same thing with the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. They have a dominant sporophyte and the gametophyte is tiny. Okay, so the diagram in your book, this is at the end of the chapter, I think is a little bit more difficult to read, but it gives you the life cycle alternation of generations in the middle, and then it shows with the mosses, they have a dominant gametophyte, and then with these three sets of plants, they have the dominant sporophyte. So if we were in class, I would put this on the board and be adding characteristics. So maybe you want to do that in your notes. But we're just going to break the plants into 4 groups, and starting with the most primitive or the simplest to the most advanced. And so the first one on the list here is the mosses. The scientific name for the mosses is the bryophytes. And I've given you the other names of the other plants here, but we're going to basically focus on the mosses. Okay, so this is the simplest form of land plant, and this is one that's going to have a dominant gametophyte generation. Okay, the second one is the ferns, so they're a step up, and so these plants now in this fern category are going to be vascular. Okay, so that's their step up, which means they can become bigger plants. Okay, there are a couple of other examples, fern allies, so club mosses and horsetails. We'll take just a peek at what they look like, but I'm not going to hold you responsible for any details on those. So these have vascular tissue, but they have no seeds. They are seedless. Okay, when we jump up to the gymnosperms, number 3, these are going to be vascular, but they're going to be making seeds and cones. And then when we get to the angiosperms, which is the highest group or the most advanced group, these are the plants that have flowers also. So you have a table in your book in chapter 19. I like it just because it takes you from plants that are non-vascular to plants that are vascular but have no seeds, to plants that are vascular and do have seeds, to those that are vascular and have flowers. That's really all I want you to get from this, other than maybe the pictures. I'm not worried about numbers of species, and I'm not worried about these scientific names. Okay, so don't worry about that at all. I would point out that when we look at numbers of species, you notice that the angiosperms, which are the most advanced, are going to have the highest number. And that's, we said, they're the more common plants on our planet right now. So you also have a timeline in your book. I'm not worried about timeline in terms of millions of years ago and what age it was. But I do like this for showing you that we start way down here at the bottom, a long time ago, with the common ancestor that we're pretty sure was the green algae. And then we start to add in adaptation. So we add in that the embryo is protected, and then we add in that there's vascular tissue, and then we add in that they have seeds, and then we add in that they have flowers. And you notice these showed up later in the timeline compared to some of these other plants, and so we can kind of follow those adaptations through time. So this is the one from your book. It basically shows the same thing. It's just turned on its side. So I'm just giving you two examples, and again, I'm not going to hold you responsible for these ages or times, but just the order from the bryophytes, the mosses, to the seedless vascular plants, which are the ferns, to the gymnosperms, and lastly to the angiosperms. So we're going to start and put in some details on each one of these groups of plants. So we're going to start with the bryophytes, which are non-vascular. I will be basically focusing on the mosses. So they do not have true root stems and leaves, because that would be vascular tissue. The gametophyte is dominant. It's very small, so it's close to the ground because it doesn't have any vascular tissue to bring up water. Okay, so it's going to live where there's some moisture, could be in the shady parts of the forest, on the north side of the base of the trees, next to a stream or a pond or something like that. So they need water for photosynthesis, but they also need water for the sperm to actually be able to swim to the egg. So they're going to have to be, they're not going to survive where it's hot and dry. So just a couple of pictures. You can see mosses growing on the surface of a rock, but it's pretty flat, and you can also see them growing under the trees in a forest, but they don't get tall. Okay, so this diagram, much bigger than how big they get in real life, but it's nice for showing you the parts. So this one over here on the left, the green part, that's the gametophyte, and that's what you see growing most of the time. And the only time the sporophyte shows up is when it's ready to produce the sporophyte, or the spores. Okay, so it pops up, produces spores, and then it's gone, and that's why it's considered the non-dominant part of the fern plant. The moss plant. So here you can see the real thing. And so those little brown guys, those are the sporophytes, and they just come up when they're ready to drop spores. Okay, just examples of maybe where you've seen moss in real life. Sphagnum moss looks like this. This is living sphagnum moss. This is dried out sphagnum moss. And so you might find this at the garden center to put in the top of your pots if you're planting plants in pots and you want to conserve moisture. People use it for all different kinds of craft projects, so they sell it at Hobby Lobby and Michael's and places like that. So these mosses are used for other things besides, decorative or something like that. Just so you can see what a liverwort looks like. Whoever the first person was who discovered these thought they looked like livers. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's where that name came from. And this, another picture from your book, kind of showing they're pretty small and low-lying. And then this bottom right picture here, this would be the hornwort. So they're also small and low-lying, but when they get ready to produce spores, they produce these horns that will come up and produce the spores. Okay, so we come to the vascular plants, and we've used this term several times, but This is our next step up, and these are plants that have what we would consider true roots, stems, and leaves. And so that means that they have the vascular tissue, the tubes inside that can carry the nutrients and the water. And so we do differentiate between these two different types of vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. And xylem is the tissue that carries water up and down, and phloem is the tissue that carries the sugars or the nutrients. So there's a lot more we could say about this, but that's all we're going to say for this course. Okay. I did want to show you a picture just so you realize you do not have to be able to recognize these. But if you look, each of these little holes within these cross sections, so this one here is a cross section through a leaf, and this one is a cross section through a stem and through a root. You notice they all have these little holes, which are cross sections through tubes, and they are arranged differently depending on if you're looking at a leaf or a stem or a root. That you would have to know in botany. Definitely don't have to know that in non-majors biology. Okay, so the first set of vascular plants are the seedless vascular plants. So they have vascular tissue, they can grow a little bit bigger, but they don't make seeds, they only make spores. So we're going to focus on ferns. I'll give a little bit more detail on the ferns. But just to mention two other kinds of plants you would find in this particular group. Club mosses, which this looks kind of like a little tiny pine tree. It doesn't get very big. And then these ones here on the right are horsetails. They're pretty rigid. They have silica in their cell walls. In the old days, people would use them kind of as a pot scrubber because they worked, you know, to clean the bottoms of pots and things like that. And now these days, people might put them in their yard for a windbreak or something like that. So your book has pictures, and like I said, we are going to basically look at the ferns, and these other pictures here are of the club mosses and the horsetails, and we're not going to worry so much about those in terms of what you guys need to know for a test. Okay, so during the Carboniferous period, which was back in geological time, we do have fossilized records to indicate that this type of plant grew very tall. Now they don't grow that tall. Maybe for the horsetails, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall, but not tall as trees. And so this was back in geologic time as these plants died and were buried under the soil and compressed. This is basically where most of our coal has come from. So coal is not sustainable. It takes millions of years to form. So if we use it all up, it's going to take another million years for us to have more. Okay, so this is just one artist's rendition of these plants based on fossil record. So this one up here in the top right, that would be a club moss, so much larger than they grow today. And here on the right also a tree fern. And we do have some tree ferns in tropical rainforests, but they don't get as big as they got back in the Carboniferous